"Don't move," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind through the trees. The wolf lying at the edge of the forest gave a soft, ragged sound, one ear twitching at her words as if he understood every syllable. Luna Gray had learned long ago that the world did not reward kindness. It mocked it, stepped over it, and called it weakness. Yet here she was again, kneeling in the mud behind the pack house with a basket half spilled at her side, staring at a wounded wolf no one else had bothered to help. The creature was enormous, dark-furred, and trembling with the effort of staying still. Something small and sharp had lodged itself in the thick fur near his hind leg, and every time he shifted, the poor thing flinched. Luna frowned, her fingers hovering in the cold air. "You poor thing," she murmured. "How did you get yourself into such a ridiculous mess?" The wolf made another low, offended sound, as if he had been insulted by the description. Luna almost smiled. Almost. Then she heard footsteps on the path. Quick. Heavy. Coming closer. She froze. The packhouse servants had a talent for turning the slightest mercy into gossip, and gossip into punishment. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at the wolf. His dark eyes held hers, steady and startlingly aware. It was an absurd thought, but for one strange second she had the feeling he was waiting for her to trust him. Luna let out a small breath. "All right," she whispered. "Hold still." She set her basket aside, cleaned her hands on the skirt of her faded dress, and moved with careful precision. The thorn had worked itself deep into the fur, caught beneath a knot of bramble and rain-matted hair. Luna pinched it gently between her fingertips, feeling the stubborn little barb resist. The wolf tensed, muscles pulling tight beneath his coat. "I know," she said softly. "This will sting for a moment." Then she took a breath and pulled. The thorn came free. The wolf gave a sharp exhale and, to her complete surprise, lowered his head toward her hand as though acknowledging the relief. Luna blinked. "There. That's better." She wrapped a clean strip of cloth from her basket around the irritated spot, tying it with practiced fingers. The forest around them seemed to hush, the evening light turning silver through the branches. Then, from the direction of the main road, a deep voice carried through the trees. "Who is out there?" Luna's stomach dropped. She turned just enough to see 3 mounted guards passing beyond the tree-line, their cloaks stamped with the mark of the Northern Court. At their center rode a man in black, straight-backed and silent, his presence so commanding even from a distance that the air seemed to tighten around him. The guards bent their heads as he looked toward the woods. Luna felt the wolf beside her go perfectly still. "There you are," the man said at last, his voice calm and dangerous in the way only powerful men could afford. One of the guards pointed toward the brush. "My lord, that woman seems to be keeping something hidden." Luna's pulse stumbled. She stood, instinctively placing herself between the wolf and the road, one hand still resting on the strip of cloth she had tied around him. The man on horseback narrowed his gaze, and in that same breath, the wolf beside her lifted his head. Their eyes met across the clearing. Something unreadable passed through the stranger's expression, something sharp enough to make Luna's skin prickle. Then he dismounted with a fluid grace that did not belong to an ordinary noble. He stepped closer, boots silent against the earth, and the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. "What exactly," he asked, looking at Luna first, then at the wolf, "have you done?" Luna swallowed. She had no idea why the question felt like the beginning of a storm. But when the wolf pressed once, gently, against her side, she realized the answer might change everything. Luna kept her hand on the wolf's shoulder even after the stranger spoke, because the animal beneath her palm had begun to tremble, and she refused to let fear be the first thing he felt from her. The clearing was too quiet now. Even the breeze seemed to have stepped back. The nobleman stood a few feet away, his dark coat dusted with road ash, his gaze fixed with unsettling precision on the cloth she had tied around the wolf's wound. He looked like a man who was used to being obeyed. Yet Luna did not bow her head. She could feel the weight of every stare from the pack guards behind him, could feel how quickly the moment could turn cruel if she looked weak. "I cleaned the cut," she said carefully. "And I kept him warm." The man's eyes flicked to her face, then to her torn sleeves, her mud-stained skirt, the thinness of her boots. It was not pity she saw there. It was assessment. The kind that measured people as if they were tools. "You handled an injured wolf alone," he said. "Without fear." Luna almost laughed at that. Fear had been her shadow for years. She simply knew better than to let it rule her hands. The wolf pressed his muzzle once against her wrist, as though agreeing with her. The stranger noticed. Something subtle changed in his expression, a small tightening around the mouth, as if that simple gesture had unsettled him more than the wound itself. One of the guards cleared his throat. "My lord, we should take the animal away. The girl has no right to keep it." Luna's fingers curled instinctively. The wolf gave a low, warning sound, not loud, but enough to make the men shift their weight. The stranger lifted one hand, and the guard fell silent at once. That alone told Luna everything. Whoever he was, the pack answered to him. The stranger crouched then, close enough that Luna could see the pale scar at the edge of his jaw and the tiredness hidden beneath his composure. He studied the wolf with unnerving stillness, then looked back at her. "Why did you help him?" he asked. Luna's throat tightened. It was such a simple question, and yet it felt dangerous, as if the wrong answer might expose something she could never take back. She glanced at the wolf, at the way his ears angled toward her like he was listening for the truth too. "Because he needed it," she said softly. "That should be enough." For the first time, the nobleman said nothing. He rose slowly, his attention lingering on her face, as though he was trying to place a memory he had not expected to find. Then, without looking away from her, he gave a quiet order to the guards. "No one touches the wolf." The men hesitated. Luna almost did too. The command had been too calm, too final. Not a request. Not a question. One of the guards frowned. "My lord, the pack master said the beast belongs in the kennel until dawn." The stranger did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "And I said no one touches him." The clearing seemed to shrink around that sentence. Luna's pulse quickened, but not from fear this time. Something in the stranger's tone had made the air itself feel different, heavier, charged with a power she did not understand. He turned back to her. "You live near here?" Luna nodded once. "Behind the pack house." His gaze sharpened at that, as though the answer had confirmed something he already suspected. Then his eyes dropped to the wolf again, and for the briefest moment, Luna saw the expression of a man trying very hard not to reveal a truth. The wolf shifted, still weak but alert, and rested his head against her knee. The motion was small, intimate, protective almost. The stranger's jaw tightened. "Interesting," he murmured, so quietly she was not sure she was meant to hear it. Luna frowned. "What is?" He straightened, and in that movement the forest around them seemed to remember his presence. "That he trusts you," he said. Then, after a pause that felt far too deliberate, he added, "and that he should not." The words landed softly, but they struck deep. Luna's breath caught. Before she could ask what he meant, the stranger stepped closer and held out his hand, not to the wolf, but to her. It was an unexpected gesture, one that made the guards look sharply at one another. "Come with me," he said. Luna stared at his outstretched hand. "Why?" For the first time, something almost like surprise touched his face. Not because she had refused, but because she had dared to ask. His eyes lowered to the wolf one last time, then returned to hers. "Because," he said, voice quiet as distant thunder, "you have just placed your hands on someone the whole pack has been looking for." The wolf did not struggle as the guards led Luna away from the clearing. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Most injured animals fought the moment hands came near them. Most frightened creatures pulled back. But this one only kept his head low and his body still, as if he understood exactly what kind of eyes were watching him now. Luna walked beside the nobleman in silence, her fingers still stained with the smell of herbs and damp bark, her heart beating too quickly to make sense of the moment. Behind them, the forest path narrowed beneath tall pines, their needles whispering overhead like 1,000 hushed warnings. The nobleman did not speak at first. He moved with the calm of someone who had never once needed to hurry, and that calm made the whole world feel smaller around him. At last, when they reached the edge of the estate road, he glanced at her and asked, "What is your name?" It was not a cruel question. That made it harder. Luna hesitated before answering. Luna. He repeated it once, as if testing the shape of it. Then he looked ahead again. A fitting name, he said quietly. She did not know whether to take that as praise or warning. The estate appeared beyond the trees, all pale stone and iron gates, with lanterns already beginning to glow in the late afternoon dimness. Men in dark uniforms stood near the entrance, straight-backed and silent, their eyes lowering the instant the nobleman approached. He did not need to command them. They moved as though his presence itself was enough. Luna's unease deepened. There was something about the way everyone made room for him, something too practiced to be simple respect. It felt like the air itself had learned to bend. One of the guards stepped forward, eyes flicking toward Luna with open doubt. "My lord," he said carefully, "should she be brought inside?" The nobleman did not answer right away. Instead, he turned slightly, studying Luna as though he were deciding not what to do with her, but what the world had already done to her. Her apron was muddy. Her sleeve was torn where a branch had caught it. Her hands were still trembling, though she tried to hide it. And yet she stood straight, chin lifted just enough to show she was not afraid of being looked at, only tired of being judged. Something unreadable moved through his eyes. "She stays," he said at last. The guard bowed at once. Luna blinked. "I am not staying," she said, though her voice came out softer than she intended. The nobleman regarded her with a slight tilt of his head. "You already did," he said, "when you refused to leave the wolf." That simple truth unsettled her more than the guards had. She had not thought of her choice as anything remarkable. She had only seen pain and responded to it. But the way he said it made it sound like a line had been crossed, one that could not be uncrossed now. They were halfway across the courtyard when a woman in a pale gray dress hurried toward them, her expression tight with concern. "My lord," she said, then stopped short at the sight of Luna. "Who is this?" The nobleman answered before Luna could. "Someone with better judgment than the rest of this estate." The woman's mouth parted slightly. Luna, caught off guard by the dry edge in his voice, looked down quickly. She did not know whether to be embarrassed or offended on the other woman's behalf. Instead, she simply stood there, feeling the weight of every stare in the courtyard settle on her shoulders. The nobleman noticed. Of course he did. His gaze shifted once, and the nearest servant straightened as if they had been touched by cold wind. "Bring clean water," he said. "And cloth." Then, after a brief pause, "Warm it first." The order was ordinary. The way he said it made it feel like a kindness he was not used to offering. Luna looked up at him in surprise. He did not meet her eyes. He was already looking past her, toward the corridor leading into the estate, but his next words were for her alone. "If that wolf matters to you," he said, "you should know he is no common animal." Her pulse gave a strange, uneven jump. "Then what is he?" she asked. For a moment, the nobleman said nothing. He stood beneath the shadow of the archway, all stillness and hidden gravity, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. "That," he said, "is what we are about to find out." Luna stopped just inside the estate corridor, the sound of the courtyard fading behind her like a door closing on a life she did not understand. Warm water had already been brought. Clean cloth, too. The servants moved quickly now, their eyes careful, their hands respectful in a way that felt almost unreal. No one had spoken to her like this before. Not in the pack house. Not in the market. Not ever. Yet Luna did not focus on them. She kept thinking about the nobleman's words. No common animal. What did that mean? The wolf had been still under her hand, quiet in a way that seemed too deliberate, too knowing. Even now, she could still feel the strange steadiness of his body, the faint rise and fall of his breath against her palm. The memory unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "This way," one of the servants said softly, guiding her toward a narrow room off the main hall. It was small, but it had a fire already burning and a table laid out with bandages, salves, and a shallow basin. Luna set down her herb pouch and stood there for a moment, unsure whether she had been brought here to help or to be examined herself. The nobleman entered a second later, shutting the door behind him with quiet finality. He did not look like a man used to asking permission. He looked like a man who expected the world to make room for him, and somehow it did. Yet when his gaze landed on Luna, something in his expression softened by only a fraction. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said. Luna frowned. He was hurt near the shoulder. He was breathing shallowly. His fur was matted with dirt and pine sap. "That is all. And he let you touch him." It was not a question. Luna lowered her eyes, suddenly aware of how strange that sounded. He did not pull away. The nobleman was quiet for a beat. Then he moved to the table, lifted the cloth, and checked the supplies with an efficiency that suggested he already knew what he was looking for. "Most wolves do not stay still for strangers," he said. "Especially not when they are wounded." "Then he trusted me," Luna replied before she could stop herself. The words came out too quickly, too hopeful, and she felt foolish the second they left her mouth. But the nobleman did not laugh. He turned back toward her, and the look in his eyes made her chest tighten. "That," he said, "may be the most dangerous thing of all." Luna did not understand the warning, but she could feel its weight. Outside the room, footsteps passed in the hall. Inside, the fire crackled low. The wolf was somewhere nearby now, she knew it. Close enough that if she closed her eyes, she could almost imagine the steady warmth of his body beside hers again. The nobleman noticed her distraction. "You are thinking about him." Luna straightened. "I am thinking about why everyone is acting as if I have done something wrong. Because the pack does not like surprises," he said. "And because some truths are easier to fear than to face." He took the basin from the table and dipped a cloth into the warm water, then handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers only briefly, but the contact felt oddly charged, as if he had placed a secret in her palm. "Wash your hands," he said. "If you are going to keep helping, do it properly." Luna stared at him. It was the first time anyone had told her to stay. The first time anyone had expected her to remain close enough to matter. She swallowed, then obeyed. The cloth was hot, the scent of herbs rising with the steam. As she cleaned the dust from her fingers, she felt the nobleman watching her not with judgment, but with a kind of careful attention that made her want to ask questions she had never dared to voice. Why had he taken her seriously? Why had he not sent her away like the others? Why did he speak as though he knew more than he should? Before she could ask, a sharp knock sounded at the door. The nobleman's head turned at once. The air in the room shifted. The servants outside fell silent. Then a voice came through the wood, low and urgent. "My lord, the wolf has woken." Luna's breath caught. The nobleman did not move immediately. He only looked at her, and in that brief silence, she saw something unreadable pass behind his eyes. Not surprise. Not fear. Recognition. "Stay here," he said, but Luna was already stepping toward the door. The cloth slipped from her hand and landed wetly on the floor. The nobleman reached out as if to stop her, then let his hand fall before it touched her shoulder. "Luna," he said, his voice even quieter now, "if you go in there, do not let him look at you for too long." Her heart gave a hard, confused beat. "Why not?" He held her gaze for one long second, and when he answered, his voice was almost a whisper. "Because the moment he does, he may remember exactly who you are." The room had gone so still that Luna could hear the faint crackle of the fire and the soft drag of the wind against the shutters. She stood near the basin with damp cloth in her hands, listening to the wolf behind the closed door breathe in uneven, shallow pulls. Every instinct in her told her to move closer, to make sure he was all right, yet the nobleman had spoken with such quiet urgency that she could still feel the weight of his warning in the air. "Do not let him look at you for too long." She did not understand it. She only knew that the words had settled under her skin like frost, cold and impossible to shake. The door opened before she could decide whether to obey. A healer stepped out first, his sleeves rolled high and his expression tight with focus. Behind him came two guards carrying a folded blanket and a silver tray. Then, at last, the wolf himself appeared in the doorway. He was no longer on the floor. He stood on his own, though one shoulder still drew slightly inward as if he were protecting an old injury. His fur had been brushed clean, but there was nothing harmless about the way he looked at the room. Not wild. Not confused. Alert. Measuring. Luna felt the breath catch in her throat. His gaze moved past the servants, past the nobleman, and landed on her with the unnerving stillness of a blade laid gently on velvet. Nothing about him made sense. He was too calm for an injured animal, too aware for a stray, too steady for someone who had only just woken. The healer cleared his throat and dipped his head toward the nobleman. "He is recovering faster than expected," he said carefully. "But I would prefer he rest somewhere quiet." The nobleman gave a single nod, but his eyes never left the wolf. "Then he will remain here tonight." Luna looked between them, trying to understand why the air had become so heavy. The wolf stepped forward one pace, and every servant in the corridor seemed to hold their breath with her. He stopped only when he reached the threshold of the room, his large frame filling the doorway as if he belonged there more than anyone else. His eyes moved to the damp cloth in Luna's hands, then to the faint stain on her cuff where she had held him earlier. Something unreadable passed through his expression. Not gratitude. Not quite. Something deeper, stranger, and far more personal. Luna lowered her gaze, suddenly aware of how small she must look beside him. She had spent her life being made small. By her pack. By her father. By everyone who saw only her silence and softness and decided that was all she would ever be. Yet this wolf did not look at her as if she were a fragile thing to ignore. He looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he had been carrying for a very long time. The nobleman noticed the change before she did. His jaw tightened. "You should return to your room," he said to Luna, though his tone had softened compared to before. "You have done enough." But the wolf's ears turned sharply at that, and his stare never left her face. Luna took one careful step back. The movement was small, but it seemed to pull something taut in the room. The wolf's attention followed her instantly. His nostrils flared once, as if catching a scent he had been searching for in the dark. Then, in a voice so low that only those nearest could hear, he said, "No, it was not a growl. Not a command. Worse than both. It sounded like certainty." The nobleman went very still. One of the guards shifted his weight. The healer froze with his hand still resting on the tray. Luna looked up, startled by the sound of a human voice coming from the wolf so suddenly, so cleanly, as if the change had always been waiting under the surface. He took another step toward her, slow enough not to frighten her, but steady enough to make the entire corridor feel narrower. "Do not send her away," he said. His voice was deeper now, carrying a strange gravity that made the servants lower their eyes. The nobleman exhaled once through his nose. "You know this woman?" The wolf did not answer at once. His eyes remained on Luna, and the silence that followed felt ancient, like something old waking up in the bones of the house. Luna's fingers tightened around the cloth. She should have been afraid. She should have stepped back. Instead, she felt a quiet pull in her chest, an inexplicable ache that made her wonder if she had stood this close to him before, in another life, under another moon. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost reverent. "I know enough." The nobleman looked as if he wanted to argue, but the wolf lifted one hand, and that simple motion silenced the room. There was command in it. Natural. Absolute. Not learned from titles or ceremony, but born into him. Luna's pulse stumbled. The servants had noticed it too. They were watching now with wide, uncertain eyes, as though the shape of the room had changed and they had not yet decided what it meant. The wolf turned his head slightly, studying the nobleman with a look so composed it felt dangerous. "If you send her away," he said, "you will regret it." The words were quiet. They needed no force. They carried their own authority. The nobleman held his gaze for a long, measured moment, and then something in his expression shifted, not into fear, but into recognition of a deeper kind. He looked from the wolf to Luna and back again, as if pieces were moving into place too quickly to stop. Luna did not understand the storm building around her, but she felt its pressure in the tightness of the room, in the stillness of the guards, in the way the wolf continued to stand between her and everyone else without seeming to realize he had done it. Then he lowered his head, just slightly, and said in a voice meant only for her, "Stay where I can see you." The words struck her with a strange warmth, so unlike the coldness she was used to that she had to blink quickly to steady herself. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not as if her presence mattered. not as if she were worth keeping in sight. Before she could answer, a new sound came from deeper within the estate. A bell, low and clear. One long note that seemed to travel through the walls and settle into every corridor of the house. The nobleman's expression changed at once. The healer stiffened. Even the wolf's shoulders went rigid beneath his brushed fur. Luna turned toward the sound, unease rising fast and sharp in her chest. Something had been set in motion. Something that could not be stopped now. And when the wolf looked at the nobleman, his voice had dropped again into that same quiet thunder. "They have noticed," he said. Then, for the first time since waking, he looked directly at Luna and gave the smallest nod, as if confirming a truth she had not yet heard. "Come with me." The bell had barely finished echoing through the estate when the corridor began to change around Luna. Servants who had been moving quietly along the walls stopped at once and bowed their heads. A pair of guards crossed the far archway and then turned back, as if called by a force she could not see. Even the air felt different now, tighter somehow, charged with a warning that did not need words. Luna kept her steps small and careful as she followed the nobleman deeper into the house, the damp cloth still clutched in her hand. She did not know where they were going. She only knew that the wolf behind her had gone strangely quiet, and that silence frightened her more than any sound could have. "Stay close," the nobleman said without looking back. His voice had lost the softness from before. It was all command now, low and steady, built for obedience. Luna swallowed and nodded, though he could not see her. The corridor opened into a wider hall lined with carved wood and tall windows washed in winter light. At the center stood an older man in a dark coat trimmed with silver, his face unreadable, his posture stiff with the kind of authority that made everyone else seem smaller by comparison. He looked first at the nobleman, then at Luna, and his expression tightened by the smallest degree. "So this is her," he said. Luna felt heat rise in her cheeks. Not because the words were cruel, but because they made her feel observed in a way she was not used to. The nobleman gave a short nod. "She helped him," he said. The older man's gaze shifted toward the closed door at the end of the hall. "And he allowed it?" he asked. That question carried more weight than Luna understood. She looked from one man to the other, trying to read the meaning between their still faces. The nobleman did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was careful. He did more than allow it. The older man was silent for a beat, then motioned toward a side chamber. "Then bring her in," he said. "If what we fear is true, time is no longer on our side." Luna's pulse gave a hard kick. She followed without fully understanding, stepping into a room warmed by firelight and lined with shelves of folded linens, glass jars, and polished silver trays. It looked like a healer's room, but there was a tension in it that kept her shoulders tight. Near the hearth stood the wolf, no longer hidden by shadow. He was lying on a thick blanket now, his breathing still uneven, his body too still in the way only living things could be. Luna's chest eased with relief at the sight of him, but the relief lasted only a second before the older man spoke again. "Leave us," he said to the nobleman. The nobleman hesitated. His eyes moved to Luna, and for one brief moment something unguarded passed across his face. Concern, maybe? Or warning. "Do not let him strain himself," he said quietly. "And if he wakes fully, keep your voice calm." Then he was gone, the door shutting behind him with a soft, final sound. Luna stood there alone with the older man and the sleeping wolf, feeling suddenly very aware of her own breathing. The older man crossed the room and set a hand on the edge of the table. "You have been brought here because the wolf trusted your hands," he said. "That is not a small thing." Luna lowered her eyes to the cloth in her grasp. "I only wanted to help," she whispered. "That is exactly what makes this dangerous," he replied, and there was no cruelty in it, only a tired kind of truth. Before she could ask what he meant, the wolf shifted. Just slightly. A tremor moved through the length of him, and Luna stepped forward before she could think better of it. The older man's voice sharpened at once. "Do not wake him." She stopped, but her heart had already begun to race. The wolf's ear twitched beneath the dark fur. One amber eye opened, not fully, only enough to catch the light. It found her immediately. Luna forgot how to breathe. The room seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, that still, impossible stare. And in that instant, the older man went rigid beside her. "No," he said under his breath, almost to himself. "It cannot be." The room stayed frozen for one breath too long. Luna could feel every pair of eyes in the estate turning toward her, though no one dared say her name aloud. The old nobleman remained by the bedside, one hand still braced against the carved post as if the air itself had grown heavier around him. The wolf lay unmoving on the blanket of folded linen, but something in the shape of his ear, in the tension behind his muzzle, told Luna he was listening to everything. She stood very still, her fingers curled around the cloth she had brought, suddenly aware of how small she looked beneath the tall windows and dark beams of the hall. "Step closer," the nobleman said at last, his tone careful now, almost wary. Luna obeyed, though her pulse struck hard against her throat. As she approached, the faint scent in the room changed again, richer and deeper, like pine after rain and smoke after a winter fire. It brushed against her senses with a strange familiarity she could not explain. The nobleman noticed her pause. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You feel it too," he said quietly. Luna looked up at him. "Feel what?" His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the strain of a truth he did not yet want to name. "That wolf," he said, and his gaze fell to the silent body on the bed, "was not meant to be found by ordinary hands." Luna's fingers tightened around the cloth. "I only found him because he was hurt." "That is precisely why this matters," he replied. Before she could ask what he meant, the wolf shifted again, only enough for the blanket to rustle softly. Luna instinctively reached out, but the nobleman lifted one hand in warning. Not to stop her from caring, but to slow her, as if caution itself were now part of the air they breathed. "He does not trust easily," the man said. "And if he wakes unsettled, this entire estate will pay for the mistake." Luna's stomach tightened. She did not like the way he said it, with that quiet weight of someone who knew how much could be lost in a single moment. But then the wolf's nose twitched, and his amber eyes opened again, slower this time, less confused than before. They found Luna with unsettling certainty. She forgot the room. She forgot the nobleman. Even the fire seemed to fall silent. The wolf stared at her as if he recognized not her face, but something far more hidden beneath it. Luna took a shaky breath. The nobleman went still beside her. "No," he murmured, and this time the word carried a deeper fear. The wolf's gaze never left her. Then, with a softness that made her heart stutter, he lowered his head toward her hand. Luna did not move. She felt the warmth of his breath before she felt anything else, and then, with almost impossible gentleness, his muzzle touched the edge of her fingers. It was a small thing, barely anything at all. Yet the entire room seemed to shift around it. The nobleman drew in a sharp breath. Somewhere beyond the hall, a door opened and closed. Voices rose, then quickly fell into silence again. Luna looked down at the wolf, stunned by the trust in that one quiet gesture. "He remembers you," the nobleman said under his breath. Luna frowned, shaken by the certainty in his voice. "That cannot be possible. I have never met him before today." But even as she said it, something inside her felt unsteady, as if a thread had tightened around her without warning. The nobleman did not answer right away. He looked toward the corridor, then back to the bed, and when he spoke, every word was measured. "Then you have met him before without knowing it." Luna's breath caught. The wolf's eyes remained on hers, steady and unreadable, as though he were waiting for her to remember something that lived just beyond the reach of her mind. Then the fire crackled sharply, and the nobleman straightened as footsteps sounded outside the door. Not hurried, not careless, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that did not ask permission. The wolf's ears lifted. Luna felt the change before anyone spoke. The air turned taut, as if the whole estate had drawn in a single anxious breath. The nobleman moved to stand slightly between her and the door, his voice dropping to a low command. "Whatever happens next, do not speak unless you are spoken to." Luna swallowed. "Why?" He looked at her once, and there was a shadow of something almost like regret in his eyes. Because the person coming through that door is the only one here who may understand what this wolf truly is. The footsteps outside the door did not quicken. They only grew clearer, one measured beat at a time, until the entire room seemed to listen with Luna. The older nobleman stood very still, his hand lowering from the carved post, as if even that small movement might invite the wrong kind of attention. Luna kept her eyes on the wolf, because it felt safer than looking at the door. The animal had gone alert in a way that made the fine hair at the back of her neck rise. His ears were lifted. His amber gaze stayed fixed ahead, calm but sharp, as if he already knew the shape of the person about to enter. When the door finally opened, no one rushed in. No one announced a grand title. It was the silence that arrived first, and it was heavier than any voice. A tall man stepped inside with the ease of someone used to being obeyed. He wore no crown, yet the room seemed to make room for him anyway. Luna felt the shift in the air at once. It was not fear exactly. It was recognition without memory, like standing at the edge of a dream and knowing you had been there before. The older nobleman lowered his head in a formal bow. The servants who had gathered near the hall entrance did the same, their faces carefully blank. The newcomer did not look at them for long. His attention moved once across the room, slow and deliberate, and then settled on the bed. On the wolf. Luna saw something tighten in his expression, something so brief and controlled that she might have missed it if she had not been watching so closely. "Leave us," he said, and the words were quiet enough to sound almost kind. Still, no one questioned him. One by one, the servants withdrew. Even the nobleman hesitated only a second before stepping back toward the door. Luna remained where she was, uncertain whether she had also been dismissed or simply forgotten. Then the man's gaze found her. It was not a casual glance. It felt like a hand closing around the center of her thoughts. For a moment, she could not move. He looked at her the way someone might look at a long-lost map after finally finding the road marked in the margins. "You are the one who stayed with him," he said. Luna swallowed. "He was hurt," she answered, because it was the only thing that felt safe to say. The man's eyes shifted to the wolf again. "Yes," he said softly. "He was." The nobleman cleared his throat, suddenly uneasy. "Your Majesty, there has been no formal confirmation, and the situation is unusual." The word unusual seemed too small for the room, too fragile to hold what Luna could feel building there. The wolf gave a low breath from the bed, not a growl, but not quite a sigh either. The man by the door did not turn his head. "I can see that," he said. Then he stepped closer. Not to Luna first, but to the bedside. He stopped only when he stood near enough to see the wolf plainly, near enough for Luna to notice the subtle way his posture changed. He was no longer merely composed. He was restrained. Something in him was being held very carefully in place. "What did you find?" he asked the nobleman. "He was near the western hedge line," the older man replied. The thorn bushes there were torn, and the animal was already weak when the girl found him. At the word girl, the man's eyes drifted back to Luna. Not unkindly. Not warmly either. Just with a steady attention that made her feel seen in a way she was not used to. "The thorn bushes," he repeated, as if testing the phrase for meaning. The room held its breath. Then, very slowly, he looked down at the wolf. "And you let her touch you." Luna did not know why that sentence made her pulse stumble. The wolf's tail moved once against the blanket, a small, controlled motion. "He did not let me," Luna said before she could stop herself. "I only helped because I thought he was alone." The man's gaze returned to her, and something unreadable passed through his expression. "Alone," he echoed. The words seemed to land deeper than the rest. For a second, Luna had the strange impression that he was not hearing her answer at all, but some older truth hidden beneath it. The nobleman took a careful breath. "We should move him to the inner chamber if you believe it is necessary." The man did not answer immediately. His hand lifted, not quite reaching for the wolf, then stopped in midair as if he had felt a boundary there. Luna watched the pause, watched the restraint, watched the strange, quiet tension between the two of them. Then the wolf blinked once, slow and deliberate, and the room changed again. The man went utterly still. His eyes narrowed by a fraction. When he finally spoke, His voice was lower than before. "No," he said. "Not yet." Luna did not understand the answer, but she understood the tone. It was the tone of someone who had just heard a name he had been trying not to remember. By the time the dawn light touched the windows, the estate had changed in a way Luna could feel before she fully understood it. The servants moved more quietly now. The guards stood straighter. Even the air in the corridor seemed to hold its breath, as if the house itself had learned caution overnight. Luna followed the older nobleman through the long hall, her hands folded so tightly in front of her that her fingers had begun to ache. The wolf walked beside them with slow, careful steps, no longer trembling, but still watchful in that way that made her uneasy and strangely protective at the same time. She had expected the night to end with questions. Instead, it had ended with silence. The kind of silence that carried weight. The kind that made every sound after it feel like a warning. When they reached the upper chamber, the nobleman stopped before the door and turned to Luna with an expression she could not read. There was something measured in his face now, something almost reverent. "You may stay," he said softly. "But only if you remain calm." Luna nodded once, though her heart was beating too quickly for calm to be anything but a fragile promise. Inside the chamber, the wolf stood near the window where the pale morning had collected in silver bands across the floor. He did not look wild anymore. He looked composed, deliberate, too aware of the room, too aware of her. Luna had the sudden, unreasonable feeling that he was listening not with his ears, but with something deeper, something hidden under the quiet of his body. The nobleman closed the door behind them and rested one hand against it as if sealing the world outside. "There is no need for fear," he said. "If he reacts, it will only be because he recognizes someone important." Luna frowned. "Recognizes me?" The nobleman did not answer at once. His gaze shifted to the wolf, then back to her. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what kind of presence you carry." Luna did not know what that meant, but the wolf did. His head lifted, his golden eyes fixed on her with a stillness that made her chest tighten. For one suspended moment, nothing moved. Then the wolf took a single step forward. Not toward the door. Not toward the man beside her. Toward Luna. The room seemed to narrow around that one movement. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and uncertain. She did not step back. Something inside her refused. The wolf stopped when he was only a few feet away, close enough that she could see the faint sheen of light along his coat, close enough to feel the quiet heat of him even from that distance. Then, slowly, he lowered his head. Not in surrender. Not quite. More like recognition. Luna's throat tightened. She had the strange, impossible sense that the gesture meant more than any spoken explanation could. The nobleman drew in a sharp breath behind her. "Impossible," he whispered, but there was no true denial in it now. "Only Luna glanced over her shoulder. "What is impossible?" The nobleman looked at her with a face gone pale with certainty. "For a wolf in hiding to bow to anyone," he said. "Unless that person has already been chosen by fate." The words settled into the chamber like falling snow, quiet and undeniable. Luna turned back to the wolf. He was still watching her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her pulse stumble. Not fear. Not warning. A kind of patient, guarded hope. As if he had been waiting longer than she could imagine. The old nobleman moved first, breaking the spell with a formal step and a deeper breath. "Then the matter cannot remain private any longer," he said. "If the king's scent is here, then his return is not far behind." Luna felt the blood drain from her face. The word king seemed to strike the room all at once, changing the air, changing the meaning of everything she had touched since last night. The wolf remained still, but the tension in him changed, gathering like a storm held beneath glass. Luna looked from one man to the other, confusion rising in her chest. "You knew," she said quietly. "It was not really a question." The older nobleman lowered his eyes. "I suspected," he admitted. "But suspicion becomes truth only when fate confirms it." Luna turned back to the wolf, and the wolf held her gaze as if he understood every beat of her fear. A knock sounded then at the outer door, sharp and official. The entire room stilled. The nobleman closed his eyes for half a breath. "Too late," he murmured. The wolf's ears lifted. Luna's hands went cold. Another knock followed, firmer this time, and a voice called from the other side, calm and unhurried. "Open the door. The Alpha King has arrived." For one heartbeat, no one moved. Then the wolf stepped forward, and the room seemed to fall completely silent as the first true light of morning spread across the floor like a blessing. The room did not break at once. It held. It held for one long, breathless moment while the knock echoed through the estate, and every soul inside seemed to remember how small they were before fate. Luna stood very still beside the wolf, her pulse fluttering hard beneath her ribs. The older nobleman had gone pale, his hand hovering near the edge of the table as though the wood might steady him if he dared to touch it. Then the wolf moved. Not in fear. Not in panic. Only with a quiet, controlled certainty that made the air feel even tighter. He stepped forward until he stood between Luna and the door, his broad frame calm as stone. When he looked back at her, something in his eyes had changed. It was still guarded, still unreadable in places, but there was a resolve there now that made her chest ache for reasons she could not name. He gave the smallest shake of his head, a warning without words. "Do not speak. Do not move. Do not let them force you into their version of this moment." The knock sounded again, sharper this time. "Open the door," came the same calm voice from outside. "The Alpha King has arrived." Luna felt the words strike through the room like a wave of cold water. So this was it. The man they had all been circling around in fear and secrecy. The one the servants whispered about when they thought no one listened. The one even the nobleman had not dared name aloud until now. The older man swallowed hard. "Remember," he said under his breath, not looking at her. "Whatever happens next, do not react too quickly." Luna wanted to ask what he meant, but the wolf shifted his weight just slightly, and she understood that silence was safer than questions. The door opened at last. Light spilled into the room first, bright and clean, followed by the shape of a man standing with complete stillness at the threshold. He wore no visible crown, no grand display of power, nothing that demanded obedience. Yet the entire estate seemed to bend around him anyway. He was tall, composed, and precise in the way dangerous things often were when they had learned patience. His gaze moved once across the room, taking in the nobleman, the guarded servants, the open space near the hearth, and finally the wolf standing protectively in front of Luna. Nothing in his expression changed, but Luna felt the moment his attention reached her. It was brief, measured, unsettling in the way a memory could be unsettling when it returned before you were ready. The nobleman lowered his head immediately. The servants followed, one by one, as if some invisible thread had pulled them down. Luna remained still, unsure whether she was expected to bow or whether doing so would be a mistake. The newcomer's eyes narrowed a fraction. Not in anger. In recognition. Then, slowly, he spoke. So this is where he chose to hide. The wolf's ears lifted. Luna's breath caught. The nobleman closed his eyes as if bracing for a truth he could no longer postpone. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, his voice low and formal, "I did not summon you for spectacle. I sent for you because this matter belongs to blood, memory, and old obligation." The Alpha King did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the wolf, as though the answer he wanted had already begun to rise from the silence between them. Luna watched the two men without understanding why the room felt so charged, so unbearably fragile, as if one wrong word might crack something open that could never be sealed again. Then the wolf took one step forward. Just one. It was enough. The Alpha King's expression changed at last. Not in shock. Not in fear. In something deeper, stranger, almost reverent. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. "I know that scent," he said. The nobleman's face drained of color. Luna turned toward the wolf, suddenly aware of how he had been standing all this time, not as a creature cornered, but as someone waiting to be recognized. The Alpha King's gaze sharpened, and for the first time, the room seemed to understand that the truth arriving at the door was not the danger. It was the reckoning. Luna had spent so long being treated like a burden that kindness felt almost stranger than fear. So when the Alpha King finally stepped into the room and the air changed around him, she did not look at his crown first. She looked at his hands. They were steady. His voice, when it came, was calm enough to make everyone else feel less certain. "No one will speak over her again," he said, and the nobles in the hall lowered their eyes as if the words had weight enough to bend them. Luna did not know what to do with that. She had been ignored for so long that being seen felt like standing in direct sunlight after years underground. Beside her, the wolf remained still, though his posture had shifted in a way only she seemed to notice. Not tense. Not defensive. Ready. The Alpha King's gaze moved between the wolf and the thorn that Luna had already set aside on the table. Then, instead of asking for explanations from the loudest man in the room, he asked her, "Did you remove it yourself?" Luna hesitated. Every instinct told her to shrink, to make herself smaller, to let someone else take credit for what had happened. But the room was too quiet now, and his attention was too steady to hide from. "Yes," she said softly. He could not reach it. Something flickered in the Alpha King's face then, so brief she almost missed it. Not amusement. Not pity. Recognition. "Of course he could not," he said, and the faint edge of his words made the older nobleman beside him stiffen. No one would have thought to look there. The sentence should have sounded simple. Instead, it landed like a verdict on every person in the estate who had laughed, looked away, or assumed that a problem small in their eyes could not matter. Luna felt her throat tighten. She had not done anything remarkable. She had only helped because that was what she had always done when no one was kind enough to do it for her. But the Alpha King was looking at her as if that single choice had revealed more about her than any title ever could. The wolf moved then, pressing close to her side with a softness that made her blink in surprise. The Alpha King noticed. His expression changed, and for the first time Luna saw something almost tender pass through that hard, controlled calm. "He trusts you," he said. Luna looked down at the wolf, then back at him. "He was hurt." "Yes," the Alpha King answered. "And you did not hesitate." The older nobleman cleared his throat, eager to pull the room back into order. "Your Majesty, this was only a small incident. The bushes along the east path are overgrown, that is all." But the Alpha King did not turn toward him. He kept his attention on Luna, on the wolf, on the quiet truth standing between them. "Small incidents," he said evenly, "are often how people reveal who they are when no one important is watching." The room went still again. Luna felt the strange pressure of those words settle over her. They were not a praise loud enough to be called praise. They were something rarer. A correction. A refusal to let her be dismissed. And when the Alpha King reached for the broken thorn beside the bowl and set it down with careful fingers, his next words were so quiet that only Luna seemed to hear them clearly. "You have done enough being overlooked," he said. "Stay where you are." For a moment, she could only stare. No one had ever told her to remain. No one had ever spoken to her as though her place in a room mattered. Then the Alpha King turned slightly, looking toward the doorway where the morning light had begun to sharpen, and Luna understood that whatever came next would not be about the thorn anymore. It would be about the truth behind the wolf, the reason the king had come himself, and the part of her life that had just begun to change before she was ready for it. The morning after the king's arrival did not feel loud. It felt sacred. Servants moved softer through the halls, voices lowered to a respectful murmur, and even the estate itself seemed to hold its breath as if it understood that something had shifted forever. Luna stood near the window with her hands folded tightly in front of her, watching pale light spill across the courtyard. For the first time in a long time, no one was shouting at her to move faster, speak less, or stay out of sight. The silence around her was almost unsettling, almost unfamiliar. But not empty. Not anymore. When the Alpha King entered the room again, the change in the air reached her before his footsteps did. He carried no parade, no needless display, only the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided what mattered. His gaze found her immediately, and this time he did not look past her. He looked at her the way one might look at a fragile thing that had somehow survived the storm. "You are safe here," he said simply. The words did something painful and gentle at once. Luna lowered her eyes because she did not trust her face to remain steady. Safety had always been a promise other people made and forgot. But in his voice, it sounded like a fact. Behind him, a few elders waited at the threshold, uneasy and careful, as though they were still learning how to stand in the same room with the truth. One of them cleared his throat and stepped forward with a small leather ledger pressed to his chest. He explained, in the formal tone of a man trying very hard not to sound ashamed, that the estate records had been reviewed. The names of the servants who had mocked Luna, the account of the broken bowl, the witnesses who had remained silent when they should have spoken. Everything had been written down. Everything had been seen. Luna felt her heart tighten. She had spent so long believing that the people who looked through her would never be made to answer for it. Yet the Alpha King only listened, still and composed, as if this was not inconvenience, but duty. When the elder finished, the king reached out and took the ledger with one hand. He did not open it at once. He only held it, eyes dark and unreadable for a moment, before setting it on the table beside the bowl of herbs and the thorn that had started all of this. No more hidden cruelty, he said. The room fell into complete silence. Then, with a small motion of his hand, he ordered the servants who had been assigned to Luna to remain. Not as punishment. As witness. As proof that the estate would be different from this day forward. Luna almost could not believe it when one of the older women bowed her head and apologized, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the awkward honesty of someone who had finally been forced to see what she had done. It was not enough to erase the past. Nothing could do that. But it was the first time anyone in that house had chosen truth over comfort. The Alpha King turned back to Luna, and his expression softened in a way she was still learning how to receive. "There is one more thing," he said. He gestured toward the open door, where morning light gathered like gold at the threshold. Outside, the bush where the thorn had been found had already been trimmed, its branches carefully tied back so no one would be caught or hurt again. It was such a small change. And yet it struck Luna harder than all the speeches in the room. Someone had taken the trouble to make the path easier for her feet. Someone had decided that her pain was worth preventing. Her throat tightened as she looked at the sunlight resting on the stones, bright and ordinary and miraculous all at once. The Alpha King followed her gaze, then spoke in a voice that seemed meant only for her. "What was hurt can still heal," he said. "And what was ignored can still be honored." Luna felt the words settle deep inside her, where fear had lived for far too long. She did not know exactly what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, she did not feel like a mistake waiting to be corrected. She felt seen, chosen. And as the wind moved softly through the open door, carrying the scent of rain and pine, Luna understood that the life ahead of her would not be built from shame. It would be built from being allowed to stay. The first snow of the season began just after sunset, quiet as a promise, settling over the estate in silver threads that softened every edge of the world. Luna stood at the open window with her hands wrapped around a warm cup she had not needed to finish, watching the courtyard below turn from gold to pearl. Inside the house, no one was rushing. No one was shouting. For the first time in her life, the silence did not feel empty. It felt respectful. It felt like a place where something gentle had been allowed to grow. Behind her, the Alpha King entered without fanfare, his steps measured and calm. He had removed his cloak, and the firelight touched the dark lines of his shoulders with an almost humble warmth. Luna turned, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was no need. The strange little wound that had started with a thorn, with laughter, and with a foolish excuse about bushes, had led them here, to this room, this winter light, this fragile peace. "You do not look like someone who has won a war," she said softly, and a faint smile touched his mouth. "I did not come here to win anything," he answered. "I came here because someone finally taught me that small pains matter." The words made her chest tighten in a way she could not explain. Luna lowered her eyes, shy in the face of kindness that did not demand anything from her. The Alpha King crossed the room and stopped beside the window, looking out at the snow as if he, too, was learning how to stand still. "When I found you," he said, voice low and steady, "you were trying to make yourself invisible. But I think the world has spent too long overlooking what should have been cherished." Luna remembered every door that had closed before she could enter, every glance that had dismissed her, every laugh that had followed her like a shadow. Now those memories felt farther away, not erased, but answered. She had not been made for humiliation. She had been made for this moment, though she could never have named it before. From the hall came the soft sound of servants arranging the evening dinner, and then another sound, small and bright, like careful footsteps. The young wolf pup from the courtyard appeared at the threshold, tail wagging, carrying in its mouth a ribbon someone had tied around its neck in celebration. Luna let out a surprised laugh, and the sound seemed to warm the whole room. The Alpha King watched her with an expression so open it almost made her look away. "There," he murmured. "That is the sound I wanted to hear in this house." She knelt, and the pup pressed itself against her knee as if it had known her all along. Luna stroked its soft fur and felt, with a suddenness that took her breath away, how much life had changed since that morning when she had reached toward a wounded stranger and chosen kindness without knowing the cost. The cost had become a blessing. The blessing had become a future. Outside, the snow deepened, turning the world hushed and beautiful. The Alpha King knelt beside her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to meet her where she was. "Luna," he said, and the way he spoke her name sounded like a vow. "There will be more seasons after this one. More days. Some will be easy, and some will be difficult. But none of them will belong to shame again. Not if I can help it." Her eyes stung, and she smiled before the tears could fall. For so long, she had lived as if every good thing was about to be taken away. Yet here he was, steady as the winter earth, offering her something she had never dared request. Not rescue. Not pity. A place. A life. A future that did not ask her to shrink. Luna looked down at the little wolf, then back at the man beside her, and the truth settled gently in her heart. The world had once laughed at her hands, her silence, her smallness. Now those same hands had changed a life. That was the kind of power no one could mock and no one could take away. When the bell for dinner rang through the hall, the Alpha King rose and offered her his hand. Luna placed her fingers in his, and he helped her to her feet with a care so steady it felt like being held by dawn itself. Together, they stepped toward the warm light spilling from the dining room, where the table had been set not for a ruler and a burden, but for a king and the woman who had quietly changed his world. And as the door opened and the scent of pine, bread, and candle smoke drifted out to meet them, Luna understood that the most beautiful endings were never loud. They were built slowly, from gentleness, from trust, and from the kind of love that arrived not to conquer, but to stay.